Welcome to AP Environmental Science. In this video, we are going to talk a little bit about pest control methods. To begin, what is a pest? Well, a pest is any organism living and growing where humans don't want them to live and grow. And these pests are also going to cause damage to plants and humans and structures and other creatures. And this includes damage to the crops that we're trying to grow for food to feed our ever-growing human population. Now, some examples could be weeds or plants that are growing in the agricultural field. Now, the problem with that is that these weeds are directing nutrients to them and kind of stealing those from the crop that you're trying to grow. These pests also include insects, and those insects can cause a huge amount of damage by eating away at the roots or the plants itself, or even the fruit that you're trying to harvest. This also includes rodents that cause a whole host of damage on these croplands, and it includes fungus, which can erode away and again cause damage and decrease the yield of your crop. Now, in order to deal with a lot of these pests, a lot of people are going to use pesticides. Now, there's a couple categories of pesticides. We can have insecticides that target insects. We can have herbicides that target plants, but then we can also have these things called persistent and non-persistent pesticides. So persistent just means that it remains stable in the environment for long periods of time. And because they've remained stable and active for so long, that is going to lead to a long-term impact on the overall environment. Now, an example of this is dichloryl diphenyl trichloroethane, better known as DDT. Now, you may have heard of the horror stories of DDT. This is a chemical that was used as an insecticide back in the day, and it was particularly targeted towards reducing nuisance insects such as mosquitoes that were living near human populations. There would be these trucks that would drive through neighborhoods spraying these clouds of DDT to reduce the insect populations. Now, later, scientists found out that DDT bioaccumulated throughout the ecosystem, and we started to see it accumulating in birds, and then it caused the birds to have soft shells on their eggs, and then when a bird would sit on its nest, it would actually crush the eggs. And we started to see all sorts of cascading environmental impacts from this. Now, a non-persistent pesticide is not nearly as detrimental as a persistent pesticide in the short term. So a non-persistent pesticide breaks down relatively rapidly and becomes inert, and this happens in the period of weeks to months. Now, because it breaks down faster, we're going to find fewer long-term impacts from this. But on the flip side, depending on what pest you're going after, you may have to apply a non-persistent pesticide more frequently, and that could lead to a large environmental impact. Now, an example of this would be glyphosate, better known as the common term of Roundup, which is a herbicide targeted to get rid of broadleaf leaves. So this is what you're spraying to get rid of dandelions in your yard. The spraying of pesticides can lead to what's called the Pesticide Treadmill. Now, we're going to start on the right-hand side of this diagram where it says apply pesticide. That's usually the first step when you have a whole bunch of pests that you're dealing with. Now, most of the pests are going to die from that pesticide application. However, there's going to be a few random mutants that are able to survive. And those ones that survive are able to reproduce and repopulate that area, which then the farmer is going to come back and say, hey, we still have a pest problem, let's spray that pesticide again. But the problem is that second time, the pesticide's not going to work as well because these pests are already resistant. So then we need to go back to the drawing board, develop a new pesticide, and again spray the field. Now, hopefully, there's not going to be random mutants to the new pesticide. But if there are, this cycle is going to continue. And this is actually an example of a positive feedback loop. Again, there are some other consequences of pesticide use. Primarily, most of these pesticides are what are called broad spectrum, which means they target a wide variety of species. And that means when you're spraying it on a field trying to get rid of one particular pest species, you're going to see a decline in the non-target species as well. Now, in the last several decades, we've seen a decline in honeybee populations. Honeybees are natural pollinators, and they are often the victims of unintended pesticide overspray. Because they also tend to hang out around these crop fields, they're going to die off when pesticides are used. Now, this is not the only reason for colony collapse disorder in honeybees. However, it's one of many. We also see biomagnification happening as a result of pesticide use. We will talk about this more in Unit 8 of this course. And just as a brief overview, biomagnification is just talking about pesticides and other chemicals accumulating within the tissues as you move up the food chain. So organisms at the top of the food chain, like our top predators, are going to be severely impacted by these particular chemicals accumulating in their tissues. Pesticides also don't always stay in one location. They can move due to wind blowing them from one field to another during the application process. They can move due to runoff if it rains shortly after their application. It can also seep into the soil and contaminate groundwater and all sorts of other methods. But here's the thing, farmers don't want to spend a lot of money on pesticides because it's really expensive. They only want to apply as much as is needed. So I encourage you to pause the video here, take a look at this diagram and really read through and take in all of these ways that pesticides can move. Now, a way that farmers can use less pesticides is by taking advantage of genetic modification. And an instance where farmers have utilized this is BT corn. So what happened is scientists identified a soil bacteria that is naturally resistant to certain pests, particularly the European corn borer, which causes a huge amount of damage to the fruit of the crop. So then what scientists did is they identified the genetic sequence within that bacteria that allowed the bacteria to be resistant to that particular pest. And then, after isolating that, scientists were able to then insert it into the genome of the corn and have that corn reproduce by pass on that particular bit of DNA that contained the trait. And then in the lab, scientists grew that newly modified plant. They did a whole bunch of testing in these test plots inside greenhouses under different conditions, trying to make sure that the yield is still high and it's still resistant to this, and there's no unintended consequences. And all of this testing was done before it was sold to farmers to plant in their fields. Now, the cool thing about this is by having this genetic modification, these farmers do not need to spray pesticides to deal with this particular pest. So that's really awesome, right? But there's still this fear of the pesticide treadmill. Like, what if all of a sudden these pests develop the random mutation that allows them to not have to worry about this BT corn being resistant to them? Like, what would happen? So farmers need to be careful with how they apply this technology. And one of the ways that they deal with that is by creating what's called a pest refuge. Now, within their field, they plant some of the traditional non-BT corn and they plant some of that genetically modified BT corn right next to it. And there's a couple ways you can do that. You can plant it in linear blocks or brackets or just around the border, or more commonly, and what we're starting to see more frequently, is integrating it throughout the entire field. So what they do is they purchase this corn that is called refuge in a bag, or other types where they're kind of mixing the seeds, where you have the non-BT corn and the genetically modified corn all mixed together. So as you plant it, it's totally random which plant is genetically modified and which one's not. But how does this refuge really work? Well, this has to do with, thinking back to genetics here, crossbreeding of these random mutants that are resistant to the BT corn and the typical wild type that is not able to survive on the BT corn. So when you cross these two, the offspring are going to have that wild phenotype, and they are not going to be able to eat or feed on that Bt corn. So this is a way that farmers are able to avoid the pesticide treadmill. So overall, are pesticides good or bad? Well, in general, they're easy to use. They increase the yields, they increase the profits, so all good things, right? But the bad would be they could lead to the pesticide treadmill. They could lead to artificial selection of pesticide-resistant pests. And that persistence in the environment is something to keep in mind. You don't want to have persistent pesticides causing damage. And pesticides could harm or kill these non-target species. So in summary, there's a variety of pests that impact agriculture, and conventional pest control really relies on spraying these chemical pesticides. There's several ways that pest control works to reduce this damage by pests, overall increasing the yield of the crop, which is kind of our goal, right? And another means of controlling pests would be this genetic engineering through Bt corn and other genetic modifications. Please send me your questions here at the end. I'll get back to you as soon as possible. And I hope that as you watch this video, you were able to learn something.